So it's been a busy week, gentlemen. Lots to cover, as I mentioned in my opening statements. Phil, I'd like to turn to you first as the program chair. Could you offer some thoughts on your experience this week?
We've had an excellent week as the program committee. We were fairly certain to have a result because, as you know, it's based. Our program is based on early submission of information, and what we were looking for was dialogue with industry executives, the participants in each session. We designed the conference for people to be able to discover the content of the published papers before coming. And then we went through the, just in case nobody had read these papers, we ensured that they were properly presented, either on stage or through the posters. And we had things like live polling, sort of Q&A within the room, outside the room, in the app. Shorter sessions than what we'd had previously, and excellent dialogue. So what is there to say about this program? And an opportunity to talk after each session and meet the speaker breakout. So what is there to say about the program? Well, it's the program that was proposed to us, and that the program, we just gave an outline and we took the best of what came. And we've had an excellent collection of really good papers on the concerns or the challenges that face today's energy industry. So how to resolve decarbonisation, how to resolve, how to use electrification and all the technical challenges that brings. Greenhouse gas emissions. This morning there was an excellent session on methane emissions, how to measure them, how to control them. We've had sessions on biogas liquefaction. We've had sessions on how to design FSRUs, how to moor energy carriers to them. It's been fascinating. We've got new technologies emerging, new tanks, new machinery solutions, new construction techniques. So really a very, very good week in a country that has been extremely welcoming.
Great.
And which we're pleased to have as part of the LNG industry.
How would you say the program's changed if you look at the last event that took place in Shanghai in 2019? Any feel for the program itself or the abstracts that were received? What's it tell you about where the industry's going?
It's moved. It's from a content point of view, it's moved with the times, because the technique of inviting abstracts without too constraining the submission topics, that's a pre-existing technique. But the times have changed. We've had the pandemic. We've had the climate crisis, basically. The demands on the LNG industry, like all industries, to decarbonize and for energy to play its part in the energy transition. So a huge number of papers do actually reflect that. As well as reflecting, analysis of the market, the impact of what's happened in Europe with the war in Ukraine, the likely, where is that energy going in a context where you're in the very long term expected to not use hydrocarbons at all. So we had a session on repurposing energy assets. What can be done with those? I mean, when we talk about repurposing, it's essentially the LNG reception facilities in importing countries. The repurposing, the decarbonisation, electrification, methane emissions. These are brand new subjects. They were not there at all in Shanghai. Not a mention. CO2 emissions. That's I would say an old favourite. It's been on the table for a very long time, but it's only now that there's the message has properly got through that we need to act And that's very, very visible.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Ed, how would you describe your experience this week? What stands out to you?
Well, I mean, just first thing I want to say is really it reminds me of that quote about 90% of life is just turning up. It's just been a fantastic experience just being here. And something I still think we're still kind of getting used to post-COVID is what it's like to be gathered together in a room together like this, to have really, I mean, without no offense intended to all the eminent people who aren't here, but really the great majority of the leading figures in our industry gathered together in one place at one time is just a fantastic privilege, I think. And so I've obviously been to a lot of great panel sessions, things on the formal program, both public and behind closed doors, but also just the informal contacts, you know, the meetings we've had on the side. I know that I've spoken to a lot of people. People have been talking about just how busy they've been with side meetings. It's been really kind of hectic for people, and just the informal contacts as well. You bumping into people in the corridor, bumping into people, in fact, in the streets outside around the venue. You know, you are just getting value from that you cannot get in the virtual world. Obviously, we're now learning how much we can do on Zoom and Teams and whatever, but personal face-to-face contact is so important. And I think that, as I say, that's my kind of overwhelming message from this week, is it's really underlined that point, the huge value that I've certainly got out of this, and I think most other people have as well.
And Michael, you've been all over the place this week
what do you mean by that, David?
in plenaries and sessions. I know you've walked the floor quite a bit in the
Yes.
exhibition area. So as you reflect on your experience this week, what stands out?
Well, what I would say is that we're all bombarded from day to day these days in social media threads, constant news, information, and then we're getting partial information from day to day from ad hoc or individual meetings that we have with our partners. But to come to an event like this, what you get, well, you get two things actually. First of all, I think you get the signal from the noise. You can see more easily the signal through all the noise that we deal with every day in what I think Ed called the virtual world. It comes through what really matters and what really doesn't matter. But the other thing, and this is why I come to events like this one, it's the mood. It's the mood that you want to measure and feel, or sometimes I say it's like feeling the temperature. The mood on the plenaries, the mood in the breakout sessions, the mood as you walk around the exhibition hall. And for me, I always look for one word to sum up the mood, and I think the word I'm going to go for is confidence. I had a sense of the confidence that the industry had, and that was not obvious to me before we came, because we've been through a lot and we faced a lot of challenges, and we have a climate crisis, we've been through a pandemic, we're going through the weaponization of energy and geopolitics, we've seen extraordinary price volatility to manage, and yet we've heard many different perspectives, but I think we have a common confidence about where the industry is moving. I can say more about that, but that was the overwhelming mood that I felt in the last 4 days.
It's a great perspective. Anything to add, Ed, or are you...
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, as you say, just in terms of this being an industry that's in a real upswing at the moment, tremendous amount of activity going on, a lot of construction, a lot of contracting, great increase in supply projected for the coming years, and an industry where, again, we've been reminded very vividly by the crisis of the past 2 years just how important LNG is to the world, for gas, but just in general terms for all of our energy supplies. And I think we've definitely seen that reflected here, as Michael says.
Yeah, I think I certainly would agree with that. Number one, after 4 years, it is great to see so many familiar faces and meet new friends. And it's hard to believe that it's been 4 years since the last one. But there is that sense of confidence. I even heard statements like, well, technology's not an issue. Yes, we need it, it's going to evolve, but we got it. We know how to do this. We can advance, we can decarbonize. And that confidence really came through, despite the fact that the industry has a lot of challenges ahead, right? And challenges that won't be resolved in many cases even before we come together again in Qatar in 2026. Ed, you want to tackle that? What might we either working on today that's still going to be an issue in 26, or maybe some things we don't know about yet?
Well, clearly, the number one challenge is decarbonisation. As Phil mentioned, I mean, it's something we've heard a lot about during the course of this week. In a way, I was almost surprised that we did hear as much about it as we did because of, I say, given the events of the past 2 years, given sky-high prices, gas in Europe at over $100 per MMBTU and so on. Obviously, energy security, reliability, and affordability have rocketed right up the policy agenda and the agenda for the industry as well. But even despite that, decarbonisation is still seen as very, very important, and a lot of people are working on it in a lot of different ways. And you can see why we're also in a period where we've just had the 3 hottest days in terms of global average temperatures on record. We've had, I saw someone estimating that the month of June was the hottest for 120,000 years or something. So the issue of climate is not going away, it's very much with us. And in terms of the crucial challenge that the industry is going to have to address in the coming years and decades, it's going to be reconciling everything we know about demand for energy, the huge demand for energy, particularly in the developing world, and where demand for energy is only going to grow, and issues of decarbonisation, reducing emissions, preventing the worst impacts of climate change, and the question of how the LNG industry, as part of the broader energy system, works to resolve that conflict and those tensions. That's going to be at the heart of everything we have to do, I think, for years to come.
Great. Michael, what do you think? When we get together 3 years from now, what should we be prepared to discuss?
Well, I think, first of all, if I start on the market commercial side rather than the technology side, I think one thing I want to emphasize is that the loss of Russian gas from the global system, and it is a loss to the global system, that's something that came through this week. This is not an issue that's behind us. This is an issue we're going to be living with for the next 3 years. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the industry responds over this 3-year period as we go into LNG 2026. What we have learned this week and what we saw with an announcement of a final investment decision yesterday is that the platform for a new wave of supply is being set up. But it takes time. We know in the industry that it takes time to build things, it takes time to bring things on. So, an important point, by the way, we always need to communicate to policymakers. We have the answers, but we need time to bring them forward. So that new wave of supply is really going to be a post-2026 phenomenon, and I think there is going to be a lot of soul-searching about how we get through the next 3 years, which we refer to as years of reshuffling as we reshuffle existing trade between different regions of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as you say, until this kind of the current wave of construction gets completed and the new wave of supply comes on, as you say, between now and LNG 2026, there could well be considerable turbulence in the market ahead, couldn't there? I think when you think about what happened in Europe last year, was obviously hugely disruptive to Europe, hugely disruptive in global markets to LNG customers all around the world. It was still better than it could have been, right? If there had been a really severe cold winter in Europe, things could have been even worse. And there was a great comment, I think it was Michael Lewis of Uniper said this in one of the panel sessions, I think it might be the one that you moderated. He said, praying for a warm winter doesn't count as an energy policy.
That's one of the great quotes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the most memorable things people said during the week. But it's absolutely right. And the sense that there could still be tough times ahead, I think, is something that people are still not quite... I mean, I think probably it's understood in this room and at this event, but in the wider world, very much not properly taken on board.
Well, I wanted to ask Ed, if I may, with your journalistic background, is there a problem when we get up and we say we're moving forward, we're investing, and the supply is coming, to communicate that to the lay audience, that doesn't mean that it's there tomorrow? Is that a difficult message to communicate?
I think it absolutely is. I think you've absolutely put your finger on it there, and I think it's partly, of course, that politicians don't like to tell people bad news, and so politicians like to be seen to be doing something. They say, well, we're bringing in all these floating regas terminals, and we've got all this work underway, and we're building new pipelines, and there's all this construction activity, which means that supply will increase. And the part that says, but actually the supply is not really going to be there till 2026 and beyond is kind of, that messaging doesn't come across very well. And so, yeah, I think you're right, absolutely right. There's a fundamental problem there.
You mentioned Russian gas. I have two questions about that. I think one for you, Michael, and one for Philip. Is it didn't come to Europe, Russian gas didn't come to Europe in a pipe. Didn't it go elsewhere in the world, or did it get shut in? And the question I have for Philip after that is, notwithstanding the warm winter, what did technology do to help Europe respond so quickly to the shortage and make up the difference with LNG? So perhaps, Michael, you first?
There were a few discordant voices saying, are we talking about Europe too much? And I may be guilty based in London. But I think it's a really important point to emphasize that this is a loss to the global supply system. This is not gas that has been redirected elsewhere in the way that oil has been redirected very strongly into India. So in the case of oil, it's been a reshuffling of trade. In the case of gas, it's been a loss of a volume. And LNG has been able to replace the lost Russian gas in Europe by showing extreme flexibility, its ability to divert. But it's not been able to add incremental molecules overnight to the global system. So we're all feeling it. And those spot prices that we produce at S&P Platts are telling us the pain that is being recorded for the buyers all over the world, which was faced by that gas that is stranded in Western Siberia.
Okay. And Philip, the evolution of technology.
Well, to answer your question, David, so to bring an LNG project on stream, it implies that you have the natural gas reserves. And in the development sequence, the first thing to do is to do the seismic testing and evaluate the well, the reserves, find the site, and so on. The actual project construction period can be accelerated by various number of techniques. In particular, building off-site. So building, that we've had a lot of several presentations at this conference about modularized trains that are built in the new yards in Asia that are delivered to site as completed operational units, pre-commissioned in some sense, ready to operate. And that will accelerate the project. That would accelerate the project. So for projects which pre-existed the sudden loss of, let's call it Russian gas. Those projects have all come out of the cupboard and back onto the drawing board, and a lot of those projects are proceeding as modularized projects for reasons of fast execution and reliable execution. Beyond that, looking for more gas reserves, I'm not actually certain there is a problem with gas reserves. We know of quite a few fields that are sitting there waiting to be drilled. So the main thing is a major factor is collaboration between the parties, the contracting scheme, whether you insert bid cycles, whether the client assumes what appetite the investor has for assuming risk in the project. All these can accelerate the execution. And we are in a kind of accelerated mode of production where the entire supply chain is, and I'm speaking for a lot of companies here, so I hope I'm not upsetting anybody, but the entire supply chain is heavily loaded at the moment.
And I just wanted to pick up on something Michael said, to your point, as he said, but are we talking about Europe too much? Another great quote that I heard during the week was someone in the Diplomatic Forum on Monday. He said, if Europe isn't secure, nobody is secure. And I think that's a really important point to think about. And of course, that was exactly what happened last year, was that Europe was not secure, and so they went into the market and essentially outbid other customers around the world, particularly at the expense of buyers in Asia. And so, if we're in that position again, when Europe wants the gas, it has the resources to pay for it, and it will do. And so Europe's problem becomes everybody's problem. And I think that's a really important thing to think about for the future. Sorry.
That's really interesting. I hadn't picked up on that quote, and it's the fascinating corollary. We've spent this week discussing decarbonisation and security of supply, and the answer on Europe is if Europe isn't secure, then nobody's secure. And in the decarbonisation discussion, it was said if Asia doesn't reach net zero, nobody reaches net zero. It is a nice corollary to the two.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's a global world.
It's a global business,
indeed.
yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, so much during the week was the discussion about the trilemma, right? The ability to, and the fact that you need to provide reliable energy that's affordable and it's clean, particularly, well, everywhere, but the global south. And again, we don't want to stay on Europe, but there are even effects with what you do in Europe filters down to what happens in other parts of the world. Any reactions to all those discussions in terms of the relative priorities within the trilemma? It seems to me that there might be some underlying change a bit in priorities. Michael?
Well, I think what's clear is that there was a feeling that the first pillar of the trilemma of decarbonisation or sustainability had been the dominant pillar. And now we have it's still absolutely critical, but it's been rebalanced by a new focus at security of supply, back at the top of the agenda, and the third pillar of affordability. If I can get to some slightly tougher comments that I think we need to put on the table, have we managed to square that circle? I'm a little bit concerned that in the commercial strategic discussions, we've spent a lot of time talking about the importance of affordability. And I think in the more technical breakout sessions, there's been some quite concerning discussions about cost inflation and cost management. And I fear there may be a little bit of a disconnect there, and it's going to be tough to manage those costs and ensure that our product remains affordable. And I do think that the S&P Global and all the other forecasts for LNG demand growth that are pretty optimistic are generally based on the assumption that that product can continue to be priced at an affordable level. So cost I do see as a dark cloud hanging over this conference and this debate.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. That's very much something we see as well. As you say, cost inflation is very much on the rise. You're seeing a combination of both this bulge in activity that we're trying to kind of squeeze through the EPC industry right now, and there's a lot of strain being put on that globally and particularly in hotspots around the world, not least US Gulf of Mexico, which is definitely a big issue for that. And also rising interest rates. That's the other kind of big global issue. The cost of money is going up as the cost of many things is. And that's also a crucial part of the picture in terms of increasing costs across the industry, squeezing margins, creating, as Michael says, potential problems there. And that's definitely something to watch out for and that we're watching very closely.
Philip, talking about cost, is it technology to the rescue? Is it more supply chain management, more resources being thrown at the projects? How do you, when you look at your program and frankly the work you do at your company, how would you address reducing cost?
If I'm speaking as the chair of the program committee here in Vancouver, I saw very little on cost, actually. People talk about optimization, but not about cost, and cost is a very time-dependent thing. You know, the procurement of equipment and construction services, the biggest source of variation is workload. So it depends absolutely on when you do it. So in the past, coming back to this acceleration issue, in the past, a lot of decisions would be timed to sort of come into operation at a nice point on the supply and demand, where there's a nice point on the supply and demand curve, and where there's nobody else building at the same time, so that you get attention from the suppliers. I'm not sure that that's such a criteria today. Then there's the technical cost of projects. So the technical cost can be affected by improving the efficiency of production. So we did hear, to bring it back to the program, there was a lot of talk about digitalization, essentially in operations, but we know that digitalization is also now massively used in construction management. And digitalization enables a complex project to be built in multiple locations in parallel without the risk of delaying the entire project because one element is late. There's a lot of scrutiny and project controls that are available. So there is hope for reduced costs. Now, there's also the question of scale. Scale was came up in several papers this week. We've got liquefaction trains being built anywhere between 8 million tons and 500,000 tons with the same export terminal output. And so there's a debate about where the right size is, and there were presentations on that. My personal view is that what we've discovered is not that small is better. My personal view is that we've discovered the merits of modularization, which is a response to the increasing sophistication of the world and the need to mechanize fabrication of process plants such as liquefaction plants. And when you modularize, you're constrained by the modularization facility. I'm sorry about that. You're constrained by the modularization facility, whether it's a fab shop or a module yard. And there is an ability to, as I was saying, I think earlier, a capacity that's been developed specifically for modules in China and other Asian countries for very large modules, which allow those modularized trains not to be small trains, but actually quite large modularized trains. So that gives you an optimum of the advantages of modularization and the advantages of economies of scale, which is the traditional source of economy in the industry. So these are points that were debated during the week, and we'll carry on that discussion in Qatar in 2026.
Great.
Absolutely. Another theme that I've heard come up a lot of times during the week is the question in relation to cost of regulation and policy, and saying regulatory uncertainty, regulatory obstacles add time to projects, and that adds cost. And that's something which is obviously also a very common concern, particularly anywhere in the OECD world where you're trying to develop a project of any kind. And just linking that back to your point about affordability, and in particular in the global south and the need for energy there, another quote that really stuck with me, which unfortunately I can't now quite remember verbatim, but the point of this intervention which has been made at the Diplomatic Forum was to say, a spokesman from an emerging economy was saying, we are having the values of the West essentially imposed on us. That, yes, we care about climate. Climate is an issue for us, but most urgently, we need energy security. We need affordability of energy. We need to be able to develop our economy, raise living standards, and that cannot be allowed to fall victim to climate. And yet, a lot of the rules of the game in terms of things like LNG export development, how quickly projects are able to proceed, in terms of upstream production, how much gas production there is, particularly in North America, is to a large degree controlled by Western governments' decisions about energy policy, energy regulation. And those decisions are being made without properly taking our interests into account at all. And regulators, policymakers just don't think nearly enough about the interests of developing countries when they're making decisions. And I thought that was a very important and telling point. And just as I've been saying, climate is clearly the big or one of the big challenges for the industry. And you can't address energy security unless you address climate. It is also the case that you're not going to be able to address climate properly unless you address energy security and affordability at the same time. As you talk about the trilemma, all the elements of the trilemma go together, and a kind of a political attitude and a policy strategy that focuses only on decarbonization to the neglect of the other legs of the trilemma is doomed to failure, I think.
It makes me think about going to Doha in 2026, certainly in the Middle East, but also, let's call it a gateway to Africa in terms of some of the expected developments there, both in demand and also production, that I think it's a great opportunity to continue and to deepen some of those discussions. Yeah. So you're all experienced conference goers, LNG conference goers, knowledgeable about the markets. What surprised you this week? Did anything jump out? It's like, wow, this is different than I thought it was going to be. Any reaction, Michael?
Well, I think the first thing is this is an industry. I think it's a little surprising, perhaps, but this is an industry that is managing to walk and chew gum at the same time. And what I mean by that is that we are able to deal with a short-term security of supply geopolitical crisis and work on longer-term decarbonization processes. And I just love seeing how we've been able to react to a short-term crisis, but to maintain this focus and do these two tracks. Mm-hmm. So that slightly surprised me, you could say. Okay. Maybe the other thing that I could add, it's not exactly a surprise, but I think it was very, very fortunate or fortuitous that we're meeting here in Vancouver, in Canada. It does give us a privileged opportunity to get more familiar with what's going on in the region. And I was really struck by the template that's being developed for development of Canadian LNG, by the ESG and environmental story, which I think is totally compelling for the Canadian LNG projects, and by the quiet progress. As one developer privately said to me, people seem to think I wasn't working during COVID from home, but actually we were doing a lot of discrete planning and development, and I could really feel the traction that we're seeing in Canadian LNG. So that came through as something of a pleasant surprise for me.
Great. Ed?
So the thing that's really struck me, and just to echo what Michael said, the thing that's been particularly valuable for me about coming here to Vancouver is looking at the development of the Canadian LNG industry, and in particular, the involvement of First Nations. And that's the thing which I'd sort of kind of knew about, but it's the difference between knowing about something intellectually and seeing it with your own eyes and being on the ground, meeting the people. And so, when you have a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the event, and when you have the First Nations storytelling and so on in the reception on Monday night and so on, really brought it home the ways that the industry in Canada has worked with First Nations to find a positive platform to move forward. And when you think about royalty arrangements for LNG Canada, think about the way that wood fibre LNG has been working there with the Squamish Nation in terms of essentially, that's been doing the permitting, that all the policy and regulatory work that's been run by the First Nation. And then in particular, think about Cedar LNG, where there's actually the First Nation community has the majority stake, is the majority shareholder in that project. This is really pretty radical stuff, actually. I can't think of anywhere around the world where the industry is working on that same basis of giving so much buy-in and commitment to local communities, whoever they might be. And it's interesting, I was talking to some Canadians about it last night, and I was saying how impressed I'd been by this and how it was really kind of interesting to think about the relevance of this perhaps to the global industry. And the Canadians were saying, well, we don't kind of think about it so much because it's just sort of natural to us, it's just what we do and it's the way the industry operates. But it seemed to me that, I'm not sure how exportable it is, but it is definitely something that the global LNG industry can learn from in terms of project development, community relations, the social license to operate, how you get buy-in from local communities in the areas where you're operating. I think the Canadian model is really interesting and compelling, and definitely I think that's something a lot of people would benefit from studying it closely. So that was a key sort of, again, not exactly a surprise, but really kind of powerful, unexpected message that I've taken from being here.
I have to agree. We've really been privileged to have the conference here at this point in time with all the development. It's, and I agree, what a template for future development around the world. I mean, all parties there to be congratulated. And, I think back at, we've been lucky, maybe better than good sometimes. I think of some of these conferences. We were in Houston in 2013 at the outset of the growth of the US LNG business. We were in Perth in the early stages of the Australian, and now we're here. So again, maybe Phil, luckier than good, but it's been a privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree entirely. It's been great to be in Canada, and what we've discovered here is a new member of our club. It doesn't finish here. We'll see Canada participating more and more, and they brought to the table good practice. This notion of taking care of the environment and going beyond what is contractually due, what the regulations require. I don't know if you're still asking me for my surprises. I did have other surprises. I was surprised by the very good quality of the people we saw on the plenaries, how well informed everybody is these days. We used to live in a world where you had, experts, and then you had the executives, and the executives had probably not a very good chance of being able to explain what the experts were saying. But this seems, in my view, this has changed a little bit, and I would just hypothesize that it's due to COVID, because meetings have become more inclusive. Social media has broken to some extent the lineage, the ranking in some of our companies, and it's been a good thing. It's because when we have the right information, we make the right decisions. So that was one. The other observation is that there are an extraordinary number of excellent papers presented by companies that a few years ago were rather dependent on the traditional international oil companies or oil and gas companies for their project management and technology, and now they're leading from the front and doing a great job with a lot of young and talented people, or young from my perspective, and talented people who are describing their experience, developments, how they've solved operational problems, and so on. So those are the two surprises.
Yeah, great perspective. By being here in person, you can see the workforce turning over in front of your very eyes. Maybe it's the fact we're getting older, but whether it's in papers, at the booths, in the cocktail parties afterwards, they seem to get younger and younger as the evening goes on. but it's really something you get, that vibrancy you get by being here in person. So we've covered so much in this conference, but a lot of people weren't here. Maybe some noticeable gaps in the area of maybe the opposition or even to some degree a lot of policymakers. What should some of these folks know, particular policymakers know, about this industry and its commitment to solving the trilemma, if you will, as we leave and we perhaps try to project those messages to those that weren't here, benefiting from these discussions? Ed, I'll start with you.
Very simple message, again, that I heard during the week, which I thought was one of those, it's kind of obvious, but just captures it really well. It's clear that we need a lot more renewable energy in the world. That's absolutely true. Renewables, other kinds of low-carbon energy, we need that. But restricting natural gas and stopping the growth of the gas industry does nothing to deliver those increases in renewables. It just means there's less energy in total in the world. And when you think about that, as I say, it's kind of obvious, but it's a really clear, straightforward message that I think a lot of policymakers do need to hear. And actually, I think that's the message that is coming from the industry could, I'm sure, be articulated better, and I'm sure that I think there is actually a lot more the industry could do to communicate its position, help people understand what the issues are. But just this central, obvious point that if you restrict natural gas, that doesn't actually help you get the zero carbon energy that you want. That's something I think that people, that's a message that people really need to hear.
Mm-hmm. One quote that was ringing out in my mind as you were talking was that as a world, we burned more coal last year than ever before. And that's despite all the efforts to decarbonize and to bring in renewables and to restrict, in some cases, the use of fossil fuels. We're still burning more coal, brought on by some shocks in the geopolitical system and so forth, but we have a lot of work to do. Michael, your thoughts about messaging?
Well, my thoughts about coal is someone once said the age of coal came to an end in the first decade of the 19th century, since when it's done nothing except grow. But my thoughts on messages for policymakers and others. First of all, if you want security of supply, you need to invest in supply. I think that's a clear but a really important message. Secondly, note the absolute criticality of LNG, not just in the energy mix, where it is relatively small in a way. I mean, it's only a part of the wider global gas contribution, but not just its contribution in the global energy mix, but its criticality that it has played as a fallback or a lifeline. We saw this 12 years ago at Fukushima, nothing to do with gas. It was happened to be the unreliability or the setback for a nuclear plant, and LNG was diverted to Japan to support the second largest economy on the earth and played a critical role. 11 years later, we see in this case the loss of gas pipeline supply, and we see LNG redirected to the market in need. I think that's an enormously important story to narrate. It is a double-edged story. By taking the LNG to the crisis point, it's being moved away from somewhere else. We need to recognize that tension, but flexibility is extremely important. And I think, I think this is very clear from the conference, but I think the final point we must, let's say, is that this is an industry which does take very seriously the mitigation of emissions and the quest to lower carbon intensity. And we have the brains and we have the technology, we have the resources to do it. But we do also need the policy framework and the incentives to help us go faster.
That's a great point, yeah.
Absolutely.
Phil, any thoughts from your end?
Well, what's missing in this decarbonisation debate is who is going to impose a global fiscal policy that's going to allow everyone to sequestrate the carbon generated, at least during liquefaction. There have been several papers. First of all, we heard it on the stage. CCS has to be part of the solution. Then we've had we had a forum on decarbonisation where there was a broad consensus that CCS could be done in a liquefaction plant for a cost which doesn't make LNG uneconomic. Naturally, it increases the price, but with the right fiscal environment, that can be managed. And actually, a liquefaction site is the ideal place to put a carbon capture unit, because you have a construction environment where large equipment is usual. You have solvent processes which are fundamental to the post-combustion capture process today, which are known to the operators. You have drillers nearby to drill the wells, and so on and so forth. So,
Phil, we've been talking about CCS for quite some time, right?
Yeah.
Some work's being done, some projects underway. As advice for the Qataris in 2026, would you anticipate seeing more effort in terms of the program related to that, or is it about right? What do you think about that?
Sorry, the sound is terrible, David.
Yeah.
More effort?
I know it's tough, you and me. In 2026, in Qatar, were we in position to talk more about CCS at that point?
Certainly, because if it's going to happen, it's going to happen the next couple of years, I would say.
Couple of years?
Yeah. There's nothing to stop us doing it now, and it just requires the courage and the willpower to do it. Liquefaction plants produce 150 million tons of CO2 per year collectively. It's not very much compared to the 50 billion tons of annual CO2 thrown into the atmosphere. So it's a drop in the ocean. LNG is not the problem, but it's a great laboratory. And LNG has shown in the past that it's able to solve these large engineering problems successfully, take them on board. And I'd be very hopeful.
Phil, I'm going to keep it with you and ask for any closing thoughts you might have as we walk away from the conference. And as I do that, I also want to acknowledge your retirement from Technip. I believe this is your last official work function.
This is the last thing I do.
This is it. You don't go back to the office. But on behalf of so many that have benefited from these conferences over the years, we wanted to thank you and wish you the best as you go forward.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Let me know how it goes. I'm still trying to get the retirement right. I'm failing so far. But closing thoughts on your part in a minute or so.
Let me see. What have I got as a closing thing? I need to look at my papers for something.
I know, I got you a little weepy there.
The question, I suppose the question you have to answer at a closing ceremony like this was it worth doing the conference? Was it worth setting it up? Was it worth coming? And I think we all agree, of course, it seems obvious for the conference to have weight and meaning. It's clear to me that there needs to be something that goes out from the conference, some sort of list of recommendations that we collectively agree. And when I say we, it's the sponsors of the conference, the IGU, the IR, and GTI Energy, to take the lead and publish something, a paper, what the conclusions are, restating the case for LNG, which is, once again, not the source of global warming, a fuel which will continue to be extremely useful for the energy transition, and that we've heard all predictions are that we will have some level of natural gas and LNG right the way through to 2050 and perhaps beyond. So we need some kind of statement, and of course the program committee is on hand for any advice that the wise people who will write this paper might need.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Ed, closing thoughts on your part.
Sorry, David. I need to thank, because I did it at the beginning of the conference, but I'll say it again, thank the program committee, because they've done a fantastic job. They've thrown themselves into it. They took up the bait, and then the speakers who all turned up. We had very few withdrawals, and I would like to think that we've done the right thing for them, that they've got a good platform, and going away from here, all of their work remains is published in our new archive that we operate collectively.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Ed.
Just final thought, going back to the question of emissions, and again, looking ahead to LNG2026 in Qatar, it seems to me that the question of Scope 3 emissions is kind of going to be the next frontier for the industry. That is, I think, increasingly what we're going to be talking about. There's enormous amount of progress being made now on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, that is, emissions generated from the industry's own operations and from the energy that it purchases. Tremendous strides being made there, real progress, very impressive stuff going on. The big question, though, is still those Scope 3 emissions. What happens when the gas is actually used, which can typically be 3 or 4 times the Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so the kind of solutions there are things like synthetic gas, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, carbon capture, all of those kind of topics, I think, are going to be rising up the agenda, and that's something I expect to see much more of in the years to come, and next time in 2026.
Right, much more work to be done. Last word, Michael.
Well, 2 points. First of all, as a technical dunce, I would just like to really thank Philip for answering all my questions, because whenever there was some technical issue I didn't understand, I would be going to Philip, and he would explain to this person who gave up chemistry at the age of 14 very patiently, explain to me how it would all work out. So thank you very much for your time.
You got 20 out of 20, by the way.
To sum up, how can I sum up? Philip was telling me that there were 150 papers submitted, and if we assume an average word count of 3,000, we're almost up. And if we think about the words on stage, I think we're up to 500,000 words. So don't ask me to sum up 500,000 words. Let me just thank all the companies here and all of you for that incredible collaboration and input and the expertise that you've all brought, and to make this conference so rich and successful.
Well, thank you all. We have tried to condense a week's worth of effort, and was it 500?
500,000 words.
500,000 words into an hour. Now, 100,000 of those words were yours, Michael.
I don't know.
But a great discussion. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for hanging in on day 4 of this event. So please join me in thanking our panel.